Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be continuing our journey on how to play e5 against e4, and we're going to be talking about the Scotch game. And that's the move 3 pawn to d4 by white. Now before we go any further, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that like button, and please go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Now, against the Scotch game, the best thing to do is to take this pawn immediately. And this is true about 90% of the time when somebody makes a primary pawn break in the middle of the board early in the game. Now, primary pawn break is when they move their center pawn into the center of the board to face your pawn. That's a pawn break. Whenever two pawns can capture each other, we call that a pawn break. When the pawn to d4 moves to d4, we call that a primary pawn break. Now, the reason it's a good idea to take these in the early opening is if we were to play a move like d6, we're starting to fall behind in terms of time. d6 is a move that doesn't develop a piece, it actually hinders our development. But more importantly, at this moment in time, the e-pawn and d-pawn have equal values. So when we play e takes d4 and they play knight takes d4, we have made an exchange in the middle of the board, e-pawn for d-pawn, and the e-pawn and the d-pawn at this point in time have the same relative value. If we waited till later and maybe they'd defend it with a c-pawn, then we're not trading an e-pawn for a d-pawn, we're trading an e-pawn for a c-pawn, and the e-pawn and the c-pawn would have a different value, and that would be a different story. But in the early opening, when they make this pawn break, we go ahead and take it. Now this is an opening that amateurs seem to have a hard time with. And the reason they have a hard time with it is because they've basically given up the center of the board, and white is the one with the presence in the middle of the board, and they don't know how to fight back for that center because they don't have a pawn in the middle of the board. And that's actually kind of difficult for them. So basically you have three main options here, and you have a fourth kind of minor option. The three main options you have are knight f6, bishop c5, and really those are actually kind of your two main options because the other two should both be considered kind of minor options. You also have the ability to play bishop b4 and then retreat that bishop to either c5 or e7 and try to play a version of one of the other two main lines where they've thrown in the move pawn to c3. And you can also play the old Steinitz variation with the move queen h4, which basically wins a pawn by force, but it's not clear if that's a pawn that you actually want. So let's just start with some of the variations that I don't fully approve of, but you're willing to try them if you want. When I was a kid, I was a big fan of queen h4 because it does win a pawn by force. White can play knight c3. We pin that knight, and really there's actually no really good way to defend that pawn without making white's position significantly worse. This is what was appealing to me. But the move, knight on d to b5, just putting pressure on this fork makes black's position really awkward. Now black can take this free pawn. Bishop e2 is considered the main line. And now black has nothing better than bishop takes c3. Please note we do not have bishop a5 to defend the pawn on c7, because if we did that, we would immediately lose 2, and see if you can find it. And the move is knight to c7, check. Winning. The point is we can't play bishop takes c7 because they have knight captures queen, because at that point the knight is no longer pinned. So the best that black has is simply to take that knight on c3, pawn captures c3. This is important for white. Reiterating that threat on c7, black has to defend it with his king, and after castle's kingside, I am going to say that this position is slight edge white, because the black king is still in the middle of the board, and that does not compensate for the one pawn that black managed to win. If you want to hazard this just to be up a pawn, okay, but I wouldn't recommend this particular continuation. But just so you know the theory, and maybe if you want to take up the Scotch yourself someday as white, you know how to face this. Okay, so going back, what are the other options? We've got bishop c5 and knight f6. Now bishop b4 is another minor option. The idea is to get into one of the other main lines with knight f6, where you have made your opponents throw in c3. There's also people that will retreat this bishop to c5 with the same concept to get into one of the main lines with bishop c5, where you've made your opponent play c3. So depending on how you feel about the main lines, you might want to try this quirky little nuance with bishop to b4. I've never been a fan of it. The main lines are the main lines for a reason. They work, and it's not clear that you really want white to throw in this extra move c3. It's not clear that it hurts him more than it helps him in most continuations. So, anyways, the line that I think most beginners are going to get the best results with is the move bishop to c5. And the reason for that is just a lot of cheap little threats that seem to happen in amateur games. There was one game played between two real amateurs. They were two YouTubers that were playing a match. I think it was like Pog Champs or something like that. That went c3, queen f6, and then somebody took here, and they lost to mate and 1. So obviously that would be a good thing, and I think just the possibility of that alone makes this very appealing to amateur players. Putting this kind of direct, almost beginner pressure on the center of the board with knight c6 and queen f6, and then having this auxiliary pressure of having this mate threat makes black's position very dangerous and very appealing. Now, when I was a younger player, I never had anybody fall for that particular trap. Most of my opponents did play the main line, or what I consider the main line, which is bishop e3. And then queen f6 gets played here. And I had a lot of people make this mistake. They would play knight c6 here, and then I would play bishop takes e3, e takes f3. And I'm going to be completely honest, even after looking at this with a computer, I have no idea what the best line is here. And I'm going to actually just stick with the line that I played when I was a kid, and I won tons of games with it. And the computer has it in the top 3 as one of the best lines, and it gives major advantage black on the computer. But some computer lines that got recommended that I'm really unsure about is queen takes b2 got recommended, but this gets really strange. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on here with all of the lack of development and all of the threats that white still has. But the computer was kind of favoring black, but this looks muddy. Another possibility is after fe3 we could play d captures c6. This has actually been played a handful of times by black, and black managed to somehow lose all the games, even though black is clearly a little bit better after dc6. This is actually probably still major advantage black. My recommendation is just way simpler than that. Just play queen h4 check, after g3 play queen takes e4. And this position is major advantage black. And I played this with great success, and I won many games with it with the black pieces. So that would be my recommendation. So I've had a lot of people fall for that trap with knight to c6. The main move is c3. And there is another cute little trap in here that white can try after you play the developing move knight on g to e7. The absolute main line is bishop to c4. But there is a trap here with the move knight to d2. I remember years ago there was a player that actually won the primary state championship and the elementary state championship back-to-back. So this is scholastic chess we're talking about. But he won it back-to-back almost completely on the back of this trap. He won in, 2 consecutive years. And the idea is kind of cute. It's after the move knight takes d4, he intends e5, and then the natural looking move is to take this pawn, which is actually a huge mistake. And then after cd, bishop d, knight c4 wins a whole piece. And he pulled that off time and time again. People kept falling for that. The correct continuation here is the move knight to c2 check, which is kind of hard to see that that's forced. And then after queen c2, queen takes e5, black simply just enjoys being up a pawn and probably has a much better position at this point. So that's the correct way to meet knight d2, and that is why the main line is bishop c4. And then we do play knight e5. We want to kick that bishop off of that very nice square. That bishop retreats to e2. And then here's what I always remember. We played queen g6. After they castle, we don't take on e4 right away. What we do is we support the middle with pawn to d6. And at some point in time, it's going to be acceptable for us to play queen takes e4 if they leave it there for a long period of time. So a person that is a really good practitioner of this is Vladimir Kramnik with the black pieces. So the game we're following here is Mirosevic versus Kramnik. And after pawn to f4, to kick Kramnik's knight out of the middle of the board, Kramnik went ahead and took right away, taking advantage of the fact that this bishop is momentarily hanging and he can use that to gain an extra tempo. So after bishop here, he took, takes, the knight retreated, the bishop went to h3, and then he managed to get castled and consolidate his position. Now, notice that this is kind of the struggle for black, is black has very awkward pieces, and black just kind of struggles to get out of the middle, get castled, and to consolidate. Meanwhile, white has very beautiful pieces, even though white is technically down a pawn here. White has a beautiful bishop pair, and at some point, white is going to be able to get back his pawn or pawns pretty easily. But this game ended in a draw in just three more moves here. It went c6, queen b7, rook b8, queen c7, and then queen f6. Draw agreed between Mirosevic and Kramnik in Dortmund in 2001. So that was a peaceful endgame, a peaceful ending to a relatively peaceful opening. So that is possibility number one of how they can handle this with bishop c4, and that's how you build the pressure. The other way they can handle this is instead of bishop to e3, when this was first reintroduced into tournament practice by Garry Kasparov back in 1993, when it was first reintroduced on the highest levels, and of course it's been played since then, and it's actually scored quite well. The move that got reintroduced was the move knight to c6, and then the normal move here is queen f6, which again threatens checkmate, and we're also threatening to recapture that knight. But interestingly enough, we tend to recapture that knight with a pawn to get our quick development. The nice thing about queen f6 is it sort of forces the awkward defensive move queen d2 to defend against the mate, and then we take away from the center to speed up our development. Now, although Garry Kasparov during his match in 1993 came up with many new creative ideas in this position, Nigel Short did manage to draw all of these Scotch games. So in spite of being extremely creative with how he was playing the white pieces, he still wasn't able to win with white. Although he did the same thing to Nigel Short over and over again, he gave him extra pawns, but they tended to be very, very awkward. So one example was this game, which happened in the PCA match in 1993. Nigel Short managed to consolidate his position at the expense of having a whole bunch of really, really messy pawns, as you can see. But Garry wasn't able to, that wasn't enough for Garry to win. He is actually down a pawn in this position, even though all of Black's pawns are utterly and totally disgusting. It just didn't matter. He wasn't able to do anything particularly smart. Well, he wasn't down a pawn until here. Now he's finally down a pawn. But he wasn't able to do anything that was going to take advantage of Black's incredibly messy pawn structure. Because even though the pawn structure is messy, everything is still protected, everything is still held, and there were no entry points into the position. And he managed to get a draw. And that's just fairly typical of those positions in general, and that's why you can play those positions and you don't necessarily have to be afraid. Now, the final option on how to play against the Scotch isn't bishop c5, it's knight f6. And this is actually the one that I think I recommend the most, is you strike back in the center immediately. Now, one of the things I like about this is a lot of amateur players are going to play the move knight c3, and you're going to have a 4-knight Scotch here. And this has been well known for a long time to either just be completely equal or maybe even slight edge black after bishop to b4, knight c6, bc6, bishop d3, and then you can either play d5 right away, or you can castle, and play d5. This is ostensibly the same position. But most strong players are playing d5 right away, although I don't think it makes much difference. e5, cd5, castles, bishop g5, c6, we hold our solid center of the board. And the game we're following was Nakamura versus Carlsen, and it went very well for Carlsen. The game continued knight a4, bishop d6, and again, Carlsen just very good at making long series of very natural moves, and just getting the absolute most out of all of his pieces, and just making it look completely easy. As you can see, he just gains space, and then manages to turn that into a gain of material, and then manages to turn that into more material, and manages to turn that into a win. And this was Nakamura versus Carlsen in Zurich in 2014. So that's a good STEM game to look at on how to play these stable pawn structures in the middle of the board. Just kind of play your natural moves, put your pieces on those natural squares, and just be an opportunist, which is kind of how Carlsen plays this position with black. But in general, I would just classify this position right here as either dead equal or possibly slight edge black. I do like having these center pawns. So going back to knight f6, probably the best line here is knight takes c6, b takes c6, and e5. At this point, queen e7, queen e2 is the main line, and we do this to get that queen to go to e2 so that when we shuffle our knight to d5, when they try to kick it with pawn to c4, we can create this pin. When we create this pin, they have two options. They can play b3 or g3. Now, if you want, you can simplify your preparation here, and you can play the exact same line against both b3 and g3. Against both b3 and g3, if you want, you can simply play what is considered basically the main line. You can play g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop b2, holding that pawn that we just attacked, castles, kingside, bishop g2, rook a e8, castles, and then a whole series of exchanges happens here where white ends up with two pieces for the rook, but black ends up with a nice, beautiful, stable pawn center. And that position I would consider unclear, but for the most part, the position is just relatively equal. So we are going to take. We take on d5 because that knight was finally hanging when the queens came off the board. We win that exchange, but as you can see, we have two pieces for the rook. White's going to go ahead and go after those weaknesses right away. And the one game we're following is Rublevsky versus Bologan in Russia in 2001. And that game continued rook e8, bishop f3 is forced, king into the middle, and after this, they just shuffled the rook back and forth, the knight shuffled back and forth, and they agreed to a draw. They shook hands. So the position is considered roughly equal, but really both players could try to play for a win from here. There's enough imbalances that everybody can point to something that they're doing a little bit better than their opponent here. Black has a slightly better center, and white has infiltration squares that he can hit, and he also has two pieces for the rook. I would be totally willing to play both sides of this position. So the other option is that you can try to change it up against your opponent's response, depending on whether they play g3 or b3. One very interesting option specifically against b3 is to play the move queen h4. And I've always loved this move because the idea is basically to straighten out black's development. Is you want to develop this bishop, but you want to develop it to a super awesome square like b4 or c5 instead of having it take a while to develop it to g7 with g6 and bishop g7. So this is a really good move on the amateur level, especially because possibly white's best move is to play a very awkward defensive move here. White kind of needs to play the move pawn to a3, and then after bishop c5, play another awkward defensive move and play the move rook a2. And for amateurs, these are really hard moves to find. And then after, say, something like knight f4, queen e4 is the main line, knight g6, queen h4, knight h4 is considered slight edge white because white has a preponderance of center pawns, and even though black has extra development, he has a very hard time actually moving these pieces. His bishop on a6 is trapped, for example. It doesn't have a good way to get into the game. So that's a hard defense to find. The majority of people are going to fall for one of the many traps in this position. If white plays an immediate g3, queen d4 is a big problem, hitting the rook on a1, and then after bishop to b2, bishop b4 is basically winning because that bishop basically drops. Knight d2 is forced, queen b2 is basically black wins. It's the end of the game. Black's up a whole piece there. So another way people can try this is the natural move is bishop b2, bishop b4 check, nothing better than knight d2. I mean, we're not going to resign, so that's the only other option. Knight c3 hits the queen, and this is really awkward for people to meet. This isn't a knight that you want to take. If you take the knight, then the knight on d2 is still pinned and the rook is being attacked. So the best move is probably queen e3. and then we're going to bring that knight back to e4. g3 is kind of forced. If we play rook d1, we're just losing an exchange for nothing. This is definitely advantage black. If we play the move pawn to g3, we're going to exchange again and come back and grab this pawn. Now here, black is up a pawn, but it's not at all clear that black is better here. I'm going to classify this position as unclear. White's bishop pair and central space, and the fact that this bishop on a6 is still really awkward, might mean that white might still have an advantage here despite being down a pawn. But it's a very close position, so I'm going to say that this position is very unclear, and we're just going to classify it that way, possibly close to equal chances for both sides, that kind of thing. So going back, we have this option of setting up all of these little tricks with queen h4, and they have these various mistakes that they can make with all these other things. Now, that's why the move pawn to g3 is appealing for people that are building a repertoire with white, because it avoids these options. But black can still spice things up if he wants to. He can play the move pawn to f6. Now again, you can play the same line against both of these. If you want, you just play g6 here, go into the same main line against both b3 and g3, and that's a perfectly legitimate way to build a repertoire here. You can also play f6 here, and you can play queen h4 against the other line if you just want to play the spiciest, most dangerous, tactical, trappiest line you can play against the Scotch to get those quick wins. So you can play f6 here, and the main line is actually a sacrifice, because you really don't want to take this pawn under these circumstances. So if you take the pawn under these circumstances, it's probably just going to favor black. I mean, ef6, knight f6, this is a great position for black. Black's doing perfectly okay here. So the main move is to actually just push. You just play e6 and you sacrifice this pawn. What's interesting is it's probably a decent sacrifice. Like, if you take the pawn right away and they play bishop g2, it appears that this position is slight edge white. Black's position is awkward enough, and the pawn on e6 is a big enough weakness that it's actually really difficult for black to play this position and not get into serious trouble. So what I recommend is you will eventually take the pawn, but gain a couple of tempo along the way. It's a little bit better to castle queenside here, and then after bishop h3, cutting off this diagonal, we play king b8, gaining another tempo. And the idea here is we're trying to tempt him into something like e captures d7 when we can play queen e2, king e2, bishop takes c4 check with a big advantage for black. So they need to play castles kingside. Now we take, and now probably white's best move is, again, to bring that bishop back to g2 and put black under a lot of awkward pressure. The difference here being that we've gained several tempo along the way, so I would classify this position as unclear instead of simply slight advantage white, and I would continue with a move like h5, continuing to spice things up and continuing to create threats with the black pieces. And there's chances for both sides here, and this is a totally reasonable, totally legitimate position to play. So anyways, those are all of your options against the Scotch. Overall, I would say that I would focus on this line, because you can play it against both things. Go ahead and play g6, and you can play this particular continuation against both setups, and I still think that this is the tabia. But if that fails, you've got all of the other recommendations that I had in this video for how to play against the Scotch, and you have all these other options available to you. Go ahead and play whichever one you think most suits your style and most suits the way that you want to play chess. And of course, do take into account that depending on your level, how likely are people to fall for certain types of tricky traps and tricky tactics. And do take that into consideration when you do pick your opening choices. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you now know how to meet the Scotch opening. I hope you learned something new about chess, and if you like this kind of content, please hit that like button and please click subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.